My name is Michael Kimpan, and I'm responding to the question of how pastors can minister to and love the LGBT community in the midst of holding theologically conservative and traditional views around the scriptures that talk about sex and marriage. Before we get started, pastors, I'm going to make a few assumptions, all right? The first assumption that I'm going to make is that you have real relationships with actual LGBT people in your congregation. This isn't some theoretical, abstract, theological argument that we're having, but we're actually having a discussion about people that you know, that you care about, and that you love. Gay and lesbian individuals and couples in your congregation that consider you a friend, consider you their pastor, and consider your church their community of faith. Relationship and proximity are terribly important as we engage in these discussions. A second assumption that I'm going to make is that your church is a church and you are a pastor who desires to have ongoing conversations with LGBT people, that you have an intentionality and an invitation in your faith community that you would like to have people who identify as LGBT in the midst of your worship services and in the midst of your faith community. All right, this is essentially me saying that I'm assuming you're not a church that has picket signs in the lawn and online that make declarations of truth with a capital T that marriage is between one man and one woman. That's essentially very unhelpful in this conversation. It's one of the reasons that 90% of people outside the church think that Christians are anti-gay. All right, so as we move forward, there are a couple of things that I think can be very helpful to equip you to better engage in conversation with the LGBT community. First of all, pastors need to be informed. Just as in the boundaries of orthodoxy between perspectives that are conservative and progressive, we have vast disagreements and different perspectives about a number of things like baptism or communion or heaven and hell, end times theology. There are different perspectives that Christians hold regarding faith and sexuality. And it's important that we're educated not just in our own views, but in the views that others may hold. There are a couple of books that have come out in recent years that are particularly helpful in helping pastors understand where people who identify as LGBT may be coming from in their theology. The first that I'd like to recommend is Justin Lee's book, Torn. Justin Lee is the president of the Gay Christian Network, and he's an individual that identifies as both Christian and gay. And in this book, he talks about his own journey and experience in coming to terms with his sexual identity and how it relates to his faith. The second book that I'd like to recommend is James Bronson's Bible, Gender, and Sexuality. James Bronson is a seminary professor at Western Theological Seminary, and he goes through those pesky passages, those handful of verses that seemingly deal with same-sex sex. A more popularized version of this book is the recently published Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian. Those three books are very helpful in informing and educating pastors about the different perspectives and kind of give us a foundation for engaging with more nuanced and grace-filled discussions. The second thing that is critically important in these discussions is one that's a little bit of a sacred cow, and I'm going to go ahead and tip it. And that's this: we need to be willing to be misunderstood. In the Gospel of John in chapter 8, Jesus is in the middle of the sermon that he's giving in the synagogue, and he's interrupted by the commotion of religious leaders bringing to him a woman who was caught in the act of adultery. This was a black and white issue. It was very clear that she was caught in sin, and it was also very clear what the law said in terms of what her punishment was to be. Even the religious leaders said to Jesus in front of the congregation, "This woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says that she is to be stoned. What do you say?" That's a fascinating question to me, right? Because they're not asking what the law says. They're not asking for permission to stone the woman. They already have that permission. They were asking a question of partition to Jesus. Will you be on the side of the law? Will you stand up for what the Torah says? Or are you going to continue to perpetuate this gospel of grace? And you know the story, right? Jesus doesn't respond to their question. He kneels down next to the woman, and the religious leaders persist, and they keep asking the question. So finally, Jesus stands, and he says, "You who is without sin, cast the first stone." And one by one, the eldest first, John tells us, they walk away. They drop their rocks and leave Jesus and the woman by themselves. Now, my conservative friends are quick to point out that Jesus in that passage says to the woman, "Go and sin no more," and use that really as an excuse to make these declarations of truth and declarations about where we stand as a church or individuals. But there are two important things that happen before that discussion that Jesus has with the woman. First, when he stands in solidarity with her and he says nothing in response to the question about what he said the religious leaders should do, Jesus was risking his reputation as a rabbi. What kind of a rabbi doesn't stand up for the Torah in the middle of the synagogue halfway through an interrupted sermon, right? So as the religious leaders walked away and his congregants walked away, there was sure to be some misunderstandings as to whether or not Jesus would stand up for Scripture. And he seemed quite comfortable with that. The other thing that Jesus seemed very comfortable with was after he invited people to go ahead and throw stones if they felt that they were holy enough, he knelt down again next to the woman. He risked his very physical safety, even his life, by being in proximity with this woman, standing in solidarity with her, or in this case, kneeling in solidarity with her. If any of the religious leaders had the audacity to throw a rock at the woman, it wouldn't have just hit her, it would have hit Jesus too. And that's an important distinction. Then, as they all walk away, he looks at the woman and says, under the blanket of, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. So until we as church leaders can risk our reputations, can be willing to be misunderstood, and can say, I don't condemn you either, we don't really have a right to make these declarations of truth if we're following the example of Jesus, if we're taking our cues from Christ. Those are two things that I hope you'll find helpful in these discussions and perhaps muddy the water a little bit more than it already is.